A while ago, I received a question from one of my YouTube viewers saying, Ali, how can you submit two forms at the same time? So let's say you have two edit forms, edit form 1 and form 2, and you want to push one button and it should submit both these forms. You may think, come on, it's very easy. Just put a button there, submit form, form 1, submit form, form 2, and we're good to go. Well, yeah, assuming that you are on the happy path. But what if you submit the form 1 and it goes through successfully and form 2 fails? How do you want to handle that? Is there a way that you can guarantee that when you push the button, both of them go through successfully? In this video, we want to see how we can do that. We want to go through different levels of validations that you have inside PowerApps. The first level being inside PowerApps validation, which will happen inside the edit form. And the second level is inside the data source, whether it's SharePoint, Dataverse, SQL, or anything else. So if this is something that you find interesting, stay with me to the end because there is a lot to cover in this video. When we are working with PowerApps, data validation can happen at two levels. You can have data validation at data source level. So let's assume you want to push some updates to SharePoint. You can define some validation rules inside SharePoint totally away from your app. This kind of validation means that update cannot be applied to the data inside data source unless it complies with the validation rules that you implemented inside data source. On the other side, when we say app level data validation, this data cannot reach the data source from the app if it doesn't comply with the app validation rules. So the keywords are applied to when it comes to the data validation, but when it comes to app level, data cannot reach because app does not allow the data go there. And eventually it boils down to two facts. One, when you use validation at data source level, one rule is applied to all the apps. If you specify a rule for a SharePoint list inside SharePoint, no matter how many apps you create, they all must comply with this rule so that the data can be updated or inserted into the data source or that specific SharePoint list. While app-level data validation does not guarantee the update, which means if something is valid here and it reaches the data source, it doesn't mean that update can be applied because there might be some rules at the data source level that doesn't let it happen. Let's put them into practice. I set up a SharePoint list called validate this inside SharePoint site called YouTube demo. I have work category, I have pay rate, I have employee, and I have starting date. Very simple, right? Just by looking at it, you can say, yes, this is choice field probably because of this color. You can say pay rate is currency because of this $sign. Employee looks like a user. Starting date, as the name says, it should be a date field. Yes, there is some type validation that is happening, but I've already added a little bit more into it. Title inside any SharePoint list is a required field. We cannot really play with that. But we have work category. It's a single select choice field. So logically, you shouldn't be able to add anything other than what we define in the choices, and it is required. Now let me show you the setting inside SharePoint. So the work category, if I click on this drop down, I can click on the edit, and you will see it is choices. Cannot add values manually, so it has to be one of these three. And if I scroll down under more options, you will see that it is required. When we go to pay rate, it is currency, it's required, and the number must be between 100 and 500. And I've specified these rules here under pay rate, column setting, edit. And if you look into that, the type is currency, so it cannot be alphanumeric. If I scroll down and expand on more options, you will see that it is required. And I set the max and the minimum values between 100 and 500. Great. Then I have employee. It's a person and it's not required. It's an optional field, but it has to be a user. And starting date is date, but it's not required. Now, let's connect this list to PowerApps and see how it behaves and how all these rules that we define inside SharePoint are translated into PowerApps. Let me just cancel this. I go to PowerApps, and inside PowerApps, I already made a connection to this SharePoint list called validate this. This is exactly the same thing. I go back to PowerApps, and I want to insert an edit form. Click. Let's add it. It's not connected to anything yet. I can click on this edit. Let's pick the validate this. And it gives us multiple columns. It gives us 3 columns. You know I hate that, so I set it to 1 column. That's much better. It's not connected to any specific item, and I don't want it to be. I simply scroll down here, and I set the default mode to new, which means whenever I submit this form, it should insert the data directly to that SharePoint list. At the moment, it's good enough. It has to take all the validation rules. So let's not make it too complicated and keep the focus on whatever that we are supposed to do. Let me just change the name to frm.new validation item. All right, so save. I also need to add a submit button. So let's say insert, and I click on a button. I add this button here, and I call it submit. Right, btn_submit. Fantastic. And when the user clicks on this, it should say submit form and FRM validation item. All right, let's see what happens and if it does anything. Let's run it. Let's fill everything according to the rules first. Work category, let me pick an item from here. Pay rate, I say 300. Employee, let me add myself here, which is good. Starting date, whatever that is there. Let me just click submit, and apparently it worked. So let's go back inside SharePoint, refresh the page, and it is submitted. Great. Probably it's a good idea to add a reset button here. So let me add a reset. Okay, that's just an icon. I add it here, and when someone clicks on it, I would say reset form, and that is the form that I want to reset. So every time I push this button, it gives me a fresh form to work with. But now let's start messing around with it. I click on submit, and you see it says title is required, work category is required, pay rate is required. For the employees, it doesn't complain because it's not required. Starting date, it doesn't really mean anything at the moment. For the title, if I put anything and tab away, it's happy. And if I remove this again and tab away, it says title is required. Great. Remember, in the beginning, when we were working with it, it was not doing the same thing. So if I just type in something, tab away, it's happy. But if I come back here and remove this and tab away, still it doesn't complain. Just tiny things to pay attention. So let me click on submit again. Now let's put a pay rate also like 560, which is way above 500 that it's supposed to be. And if I click on submit, again, it complains. If I remove it, it says pay rate is required. So basically it captures all the rules that we define inside SharePoint and revalidates before submission. Great, but there is so much we can do here. Now, the question is that what if we take out the validation rules from inside the app? For example, let's say if I pick title, which is the first data card, and I go to advanced setting, let me just unlock it so that I can make changes, and I set the required to false. Great. So now if I run it, you see that asterisk is gone. I can type in something, it's happy. I can take it out, it's happy. Work category, I call it as like, for example, seasonal, and pay rate, I put something valid, for example, 280. Everybody is happy, correct? I may or may not pick up an employee, starting date, it doesn't really matter. Let's leave it blank, and I click on submit. Did it work? Let's go back here, and I click on refresh. Oops, wasn't it supposed to be required? How could I do that? Could I simply go to inside SharePoint and click on edit, right? And I just save the same thing. It doesn't let you do that. But somehow, when your app decided to submit the value and it's blank, it happily inserted the value, although it was breaking the validation rules. So it seems like maybe those rules are not that tight at least inside SharePoint. And I sincerely wish SharePoint was better than this. But maybe we are a little bit unfair to SharePoint. Maybe SharePoint is not as dumb as we think. Or maybe PowerApps can outsmart SharePoint in some areas. Let's take a closer look. I go back to my PowerApps again, I run this, I reset, and I push the submit button. You see it complains. And as we know, title doesn't show the asterisk, and if we look into the card, we set it's not required. But when we try to submit, it complains. Let me put something here, and the complaint is gone. Let me go back here and take it out and tab away. The complaint is gone. If I click on the submit button, it doesn't come back. If I select the other two values and I click on submit, it happily submits. What happened? First, we initially clicked on submit. Second time, I typed in something, I took it out, and then I pushed submit. What is the difference? Now let's get reset and dig into it and see what's happening backstage. I close this and I want to introduce you to one edit form property called updates. Let's see what it is. I insert a button here, and this button is supposed to get any updates from this form before it is sent to SharePoint or any other data source, right? So I click this button, let's say I call it BTN research, and I call it research. This is for me, users are not supposed to see this. So I click on this guy, and for this, I just create a variable. I call it var underscore form updates. And for its value, I just say FRM new validation, which refers to the form that we have here, dot updates. I close the bracket, I save it, and I run it. If I reset and I click on research, and I click back on it again, I double click on it, you see title is blank. All right, let's run it again. This time I type something in, I clear it, and I click on this again. Let's see what we have inside the title now. Again, it's blank. Apparently they are the same, but they are not. Let me show you how. Right after I push this button, I want to see the JSON content of this updates. So I get a copy of this guy. On the next line, I say set JSON updates. It's a variable, so let's start it with var, comma, and I put this value inside it, but before I put it there, I convert it to JSON. Everybody who has taken my courses knows that JSON is my silver bullet. I always use JSON to dig into the most complicated topics inside PowerApps and figure it out. So I just close the bracket. It complains because updates is coming from SharePoint originally, and it has some binary fields that JSON function doesn't support it. So I can say JSON format. And for the format, I would say ignore binary data. I just save it. And to make my life a whole lot easier, I'd rather get this value and display it in a text label, right? There we go. I have a text label here. I bring it down here. Let me make it a little bit bigger. And I also set the overflow to scroll, so when the content is long, I can see that. So whatever it's going to display here, I want to put the value inside it. And it shows nothing, which we haven't done anything yet. Now, let's try running this app. Save, run, and I just reset it, and I click on refresh. All right, as you can see, title is null. Great. Now, let me type in something inside it, and I click on refresh. You will see this weird value comes inside title. But let me just clean it out again, and I click on research again. Did you notice title is not null anymore? It's a zero-len string. But hold on, what happened? Well, let's discuss the difference between null and zero-len string. I'm pretty sure 99.7% of you already know that. Just a quick review. When we say null, it means I don't know what it is. Before you touch the title field, PowerApps assumes that you don't know what is inside it, so it says it is null value. As soon as you put something there, PowerApps says, okay, now you know what is inside it. And when you explicitly take it out, PowerApps assumes that you know what it is and it's a zero-len string. So null means I don't know. Zero-len string means I know the value and it is empty. There is nothing in it. Like somebody's asking me, Ali, what's your middle name? I say, I don't have middle name. I know my middle name and it is nothing. It's different from I don't know what it is. So now you know if I push submit here, let's say I pick some other values here. At the moment, when the title is not null, if I push submit, it submits it. While if I come back here and without touching title, I pick the other values and I click on research, when the title is null, if I push submit, it says field title is required. And both these messages are coming from the data source. Now, let's go back to the problem that we had on the first place. Inside SharePoint, I have two lists. One of them is validate this. The other one is validate that. Try to guess where I got these names from. That's the same old Canadian joke about street names in Nova Scotia. This street, that street, the other street. Well, that's a Canadian way to name the streets when they run out of names. And for the ones who don't live in Canada, this is real. Here is the Google Maps link. Check it out and see for yourself. So I want to have two edit forms in my app that they submit to two different lists. And I want to make sure when I push the button, it submits both of them at the same time. Not one of them and the other one with error. Now let's go back to PowerApps. Inside PowerApps, I create a quick screen. I need to make a connection to the other table. So I add data, SharePoint, scroll, done, click. I just need the URL again, whatever that is. Connect. And I pick validate that. I already got validate this. Connect. So I have two connections. I go back to my new screen that I just added. I don't need this. Let me just make the size a little bit smaller. Now I can insert two edit forms. So I say edit form 1, which comes back here, and edit form 2. Okay. So edit form 1 is going to connect to validate this. Again, I want only one column. And I go to the other form and I connect it to validate that. Again, I set it to one column and I want to make it a little bit smaller. All right, we are good. The only thing that I have here for the validate that, let me click on this one and I show you for the age, I set some restrictions. The age can be between 18 and 99. That's it. And it's also required. So save, come back here, and I want to have one submit button. Let's see how I do it. I just add my button here, button. I just drag it here, make it a little bit bigger, and I want to call it submit both forms. Done. Now, when I want to submit, before I submit, I want to check one of them and make sure it is valid. To do that, I can use validate function. Validate function works like this. I can say validate. Validate accepts a data source. I want to validate this one before I submit this one. So I want to validate that for the value that is supposed to be added as fresh value. So there is not an existing record to match. If you want to match it against an existing record, you need to use lookup and refer to that record. At the moment, I can pick this guy and instead of default mode edit, I say default mode new. I can come back here and I can say the record that I want to refer to is going to be blank. Blank always means to a record that does not exist. And then I can say use form 3, which is this form dot updates. So now if validate returns blank, it means it's valid. if it returns something, it means that there is an error. Let's give it a shot. So I put it inside a variable, set var underscore is valid. And I close this. Let me just save it and try. At the moment, if I push this button and I click on this one, I click is valid, it complains title is required. Perfect. And now, if I run it again and I put something here and I put an age here, like for example 55, and I click on submit, then I come back here, double click, you see is valid, is blank, means there is no validation error. Now that we have that, I can come back here. And before I add my condition, I would like to change this name to validate that errors. So if this validate returns any string, we know that there is an error. I also want to display this guy here on the top. So maybe let me insert a text label, drag it here, maybe. All right. And the value that it's going to display is going to be this variable. At the moment, it doesn't show anything, but it doesn't matter. I just want to change the color to red so that it shows better as the error. So we're good with this one. Now, when the user pushes this button, I would like to say if var underscore validate that errors, if it is equal to nothing, which means we don't have any error messages, then submit form, and I want to submit form 2, which refers to this one. All right. This form is only submitted after the content inside the first form is valid. And I'm not going to submit this form unless this form is submitted successfully. So for this guy, I can say on success, submit form 3, which is that form. Let me just save it and show you. So once this form is submitted successfully, it submits form 3 that in advance we validated that this submit is going to be 100% successful. The only thing I need to check is that I want to make sure they both have default mode set to new. This one is also set to new. We want them to insert into those SharePoint lists, and maybe also add another reset button to reset both of them because I want to run multiple tests. So I pick this button, and for the unselect, I say reset form 2 and reset form 3. Okay, save all of them. Now let's test it. I can click on run and let's click on submit both forms. It doesn't do anything. It just says field title is required. Great. So let's add something here. And I click on submit both forms again. It says age is required. Great. I cannot put alphanumeric characters because it's set as number, but I put numbers here and I try again. It says value must be between 18 and 99. Great. Still, this guy is not valid, so he doesn't even try submitting this one. So I would say 45 is good enough. Submit both forms. Now, this one is valid, but it complains about this guy. Title is required. Sure, I give you a title, happy, work category, let's say seasonal, pay rate, 14, 55, value must be between 100 and 500, complaining, let's say 140, should be happy. Let me put an employee name here and any starting date. It doesn't really matter at the moment. And I can click on submit both forms. And both of them are successfully submitted. I can go back here and refresh the validate this. And I can also check the other one that was empty, validate that. So now this one has a dummy value inside it that we just added. I know what you're thinking. Who could ever imagine that just submitting 2 forms could end up with more than 20-25 minutes of lecture? All right, we are done with another video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know where the like button is. If you have ideas for the future videos, we have comment section. don't forget about that one. And if today is the day that you push that subscribe button, you really, really make my day. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you in the future videos.